I'm going to wait a few seconds for people to join us. We have a lot of people who are going to be on the call today, so please bear with me as I wait for our attendees to join, maybe another 30 seconds. Thank you. All right, let's get started. As people are joining us, I'll just present my introduction. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our latest ARPA update for tribes, covering coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds. We also want to thank those of you who submitted questions in advance. Four experts from REDW's National Tribal Practice are here to share some helpful guidance and answer those questions as best they can along the way. We have Wes Benally, Mike Dearlam, Jeremy Johnson, and Hattie Mitchell. But before they get started, let me just cover a few housekeeping notes. If you have any questions during the session, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to open a window where you can type them in. This presentation is being recorded, and access to the recording, along with a copy of the slides and other resource materials, will be provided to you by email at about this time tomorrow. Well, we have lots to cover today, so I'll let Wes Benally, the leader of our National Tribal Practice, get us started. Go ahead, Wes.
Good morning, everybody. In my language, thank you for the opportunity to present this information to you. And nothing better than to start your morning off going through some legislation and compliance requirements. But we hope that we make it fun and interesting for you all, and most importantly, help your journey through this information. Mike, next slide. Here's a quick snack of the agenda we'll be going through today. We're going to go through just the SLFRF funds. So my tongue doesn't have any damage. I'm going to refer to this as the FRF funds. One thing to make clear what we're talking about, there are plenty of funding sources coming through ARPA. We're talking specifically on the state local fiscal recovery funds today. So please keep that in mind. In addition to that, we'll be covering revenue replacement. That's Mr. Jeremy Johnson. Public health and negative economic impacts. That's Mr. Mike Dearlam. And premium pay, that would be Hattie Mitchell. And then we'll be rounding it off with water, sewer, broadband infrastructure, and then FRF reporting and other accounting considerations, and then leave it up for questions and answers. But Mike, one more. So as I mentioned, this is kind of just a reiteration of the overall, I guess, purpose of the FRF funds. Really just kind of moving in from the interim final rule to the final rule now. That's what's been issued by Treasury. So number one is just to respond to public health or its negative economic impacts. So this is one area that is covered by these funds. Respond to workers performing essential work, which is also known as premium pay. Number three, government services to the extent of revenue reduction. Jeremy will be talking about that. And then lastly, necessary investments in water, sewer, broadband infrastructure. Mike? And then, just to start off, obviously, to say, okay, what can it not be used for? Offset to tax revenue, deposit to pension funds. There are some exceptions for tribes there. Debt service, replenishing of financial services, satisfaction of settlements and judgments, or ultimately if it conflicts or contravenes with the purpose of the American Rescue Plan. So at the end of the day, these are the general don'ts with the money. When you're going through and taking a look at this, be sure that when you're speaking with lawyers and you're going through your assessments, that you're not utilizing the funds for these. Number five as well, that's kind of a catch-all. It's just making sure that it doesn't conflict with the purpose of the American Rescue Plan. Once again, maybe the general purpose of American Rescue Plan is for recovery, So you want to think about those type of projects when you're implementing your overall allocation plan on your award. Mike? Mike will be going through this in a little more detail in his slides, but ultimately, since it is federal funds, the uniform guidance applies. So when considering your projects, always consider that the uniform guidance will apply. You will also have to utilize the cost principles. So, these are things that, that come through with your single audit. So just be prepared that the single audit does apply to this fund. Once again, the April 1st is the go live date for final rule. However, you can take advantage currently of any of the flexibility and simplification of some of the requirements. I think Jeremy will be talking about that specifically in his revenue replacement on how that would apply to some administrative burden, if you will, on calculations. Mike? Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Jeremy Johnson, and he's going to walk you through probably one of the more significant areas of change. And Mr. Johnson? You're on mute, buddy. Jeremy?
Nope, I'm afraid you're still muted, Jeremy. You might have to go out and come back into the meeting.
Well, I could kind of pick up a little till he jumps back on. Mike, if you could go to the next slide. All right. So as I mentioned, one of the large areas for revenue for the state and local fiscal recovery funds is revenue loss. And what that entailed is basically, tribes can go through and calculate based on the formula how much revenue they lost relative to historical patterns.
Can you guys hear me now?
Oh, there you go. All right, okay. Go ahead and turn it over back to Jeremy.
It wouldn't be a webinar without some technical difficulties, right? So Wes, I appreciate you kind of picking up the slack. I think you left off with general revenues and should be generated from underlying. So basically, general revenues are our day-to-day operating revenues. That's kind of the idea there. And I'll get into more of some of the changes as far as what can be considered general revenues in just a minute. Intergovernmental revenues would exclude federal funding in your special revenue funds. So, that would be, we're not going to include, for example, our FRF funds in our revenue replacement calculation. Revenues from tribal business enterprises must be included in general revenues. And this is actually an area, later on when I talk about administrative burden, this is an area that I think has been a lot of burden with tribes I've worked with, is getting all of these financials together. And it is a requirement to include all of those revenues. So you'll see later how much, we get to relieve that with this standard allowance. So next slide, Mike. Following should be excluded from general revenues: refunds from other correcting transactions, proceeds from issuance of debt, agency or private trust transactions, and federal transfers to tribal governments, including CARES Act or CRF. So again, we're talking specifically about our, if you wanted to kind of, simplify it, it's your operating funds, your from sales taxes or your enterprises, those kind of revenues should be included. But if you took out a loan or something like that, those proceeds would not be included. So just kind of thinking about it as your operating revenues. Next slide, Mike. So a little bit of background on the revenue replacement. The way that Treasury presented this was, at some point, our economy is going to recover. And so we're doing this calculation over 4 years, or we're able to replace revenue over 4 years. And the idea is that actual revenue will catch up to, what that lost revenue would be. So I always like to kind of bring up this graph because it really helps to drive home the concept of, why do we do the calculation every year? Why can't we just use the first year and take that over 4 years? Because hopefully, I think everybody hopes that our economy recovers within the next 4 years, and that's what this graph kind of shows. Mike, next graph or next. And I don't know how much Wes touched on, so hopefully I don't repeat anything, but the general idea of revenue replacement is it's a lot more broad than than all of your other FRF funds. We're able to basically take this revenue replacement and I hate to use the word subsidize, but basically use it for our day-to-day operations. However, there are some unallowed uses. So it's more broad, but it's not, free reign, whatever you want to do. The unallowed uses are principal and interest payments on debt, fee of issuance costs, payment of settlement agreements, and setting aside cash for a rainy day. I'm going to speed up because I know I'm kind of getting up to my time here. Mike, next one. And then a couple of other ones. Enterprise revenue loss reimbursements not permitted under this section of ARPA. So this is a question I get a lot is, can we move these funds just to our casino or to one of our enterprises that were, hurt economically? You can't just transfer the money. Recipients may assist travel, tourism, hospitality industries for negative. So you can assist, but you can't just say, okay, my revenue replacement is $10 million. I'm going to send $8 million over to the casino because they were hit the hardest. You can help them. You can assist those industries with grants or loans or things like that, but you can't just transfer money over. Next slide, Mike. Okay, so this is the most important slide. So if you want to take a screenshot or something, I know you all will get these slides, but this is the baby. This is the one that's really, really important. So this is kind of the difference between what was and what is now. Revenue loss. If I don't know how many of you all did the calculation. I know we did it for a few clients, and it's pretty complex, and there's a lot that goes into it, and you have to gather a lot of information. So what the Treasury did was say, okay, well, we know that can be a burden, and we don't want these funds to just be, more burden for the user. So they created this option of a one-time allowance for $10 million of recovery funds. So, to kind of simplify this is instead of doing that calculation, every year for 4 years, you can take this optional, $10 million. It's a one-time thing. You get $10 million that first year and say, okay, now I don't have to do it again, but I don't get $10 million every year. So that's just the end of the revenue replacement. That's what your budget is. So it makes it a lot simpler. I think I read in there that the aim was for smaller tribes that may not have the capacity to do the calculation or may not even have the $10 million in revenue loss. We've done some where it doesn't come out to $10 million. So you actually get a little bit of a benefit by taking this option. And I'm going to dive into some examples of that. I think that's the biggest difference. That's why we listed it first, is that $10 million standard allowance. Improvements to the revenue loss formula. Growth rate changed from 4.1 to 5.2. So if you remember on that original formula or that original calculation, there was a floor of 4.1. So an assumption that everyone's revenue, should grow 4% every year. So the Treasury went in and just upped that 5%. So of course that's the benefit to the users. Revenue inclusion, utility revenue and liquor store revenue now included. Just a quick note on the liquor store revenue. So the liquor store revenue was already included in the calculation, but it was included in the taxes, and now it's just its own item. The utility revenue is a pretty big deal because it was explicitly excluded from the original formula, but now they're saying you have the option. It's not required, but you have the option to use utility revenue. Reporting period is a calendar year or fiscal year approach. And then the revenue actual adjustments tax, adjust for tax cuts increase adopted after January 6th. So what that's saying is if, let's say a tribe was going, hey, our economy's hurting, we need to raise our tax rate to kind of shore up some of this. that change would not be included in our calculation. So again, that's to benefit you in that, okay, we raised our sales tax by 1%, so our revenue loss doesn't look as bad as it really is. So you get to basically back that out. So that's kind of that slide. And again, that's a really important piece. Next slide, Mike. Okay, so now we have some examples of that standard allowance. And again, I really think the standard allowance is the most important part. So I'll kind of dive into these a little closer. So I'll just read this. The tribe does a manual calculation and determines the revenue is $8 million for FY20, and then 5 million, 3 million, and 500 over the next 3 years. And so the question is, and the question, tribal leaders are going to have to ask themselves are, do we take this optional $10 million standard allowance at the front, or do we do the calculation every year? So with these guys, obviously you don't know what's going to happen in the future. So they're projecting, okay, we're probably going to have $5 million, $3 million, 500,000 over the next 3 years. So, netting, what is that? 16.5 million dollars, right? Obviously that's more than 10 million. And there's a lot of room for error. Like even if it was 4 million instead of 5 million, there's a lot of benefit to doing the calculation. So, that's probably a good example of when we want to go ahead and do that manual calculation. Okay, next slide, Mike. Oh, okay, yeah. And then this one, same question tribal leaders are going to be asking themselves, except for now, the number is 5 million for FY20, 3 million for 21, 1,200,000. So now we're totaling, about $9 million, which, obviously is less than $10 million. So that's a slam dunk. We should probably go ahead and select that optional $10 million, right? And then just kind of another point on the $10 million, the simplicity. So whenever you're weighing this, you have to kind of figure out, well, how much, are we going to have to hire somebody to do the calculation? How much time are we going to do the calculation? How much, room for error do we have on these projections? We think it's going to be this, but maybe the economy recovers faster and then we have an opportunity loss. Because I don't know if I hit it before, but this is an irrevocable option. So once you say we're taking the $10 million, that's what you're doing. That you don't have an option to change gears at that point. So next slide, Mike. Okay, so now we get into a little hairier of a situation here. So we've got $6 million, $3 million, $2 million. So we're sitting at $11.5 million. So at face value, you go, well, yeah, if I do the manual calculation every year, I'm gonna net $1.5 million more than I would if I did the $10 million, right? But you've got to weigh two things with that. One, how much is it going to cost you to do that calculation? Probably not $1.5 million. But how confident are you in those numbers? So, if you've got a pretty good idea, if you know what it's going to look like, and you've got a really good projection, maybe you go ahead and we're going to do the manual calculation. But there's always the option of just saying, well, this is safer, there's less risk, we're just going to take that $10 million. And so these are the decisions, these are the tough decisions that tribal leaders are going to have to make soon. Because once, when Wes starts talking about the reporting, the deadline for this is coming up. So this is something you really want to start looking at and start considering what it's going to look like. Next slide, Mike. I think that might be it, actually. Yeah.
Hey, Jeremy,
so now I'll kick it over to Mike.
Hey, Jeremy.
Yes, sir.
Quick thing. With respect to revenue replacement, one thing you'll need to really consider is that, let's just say, for example, the tribe receives $15 million in total SLFRF funding. You're only allowed to take, if you choose the $10 million option, you can only choose 10 million of that 15. And then the rest of the 5 will be allocated based on the other options under the FRF funding. Now, if you swing it the other way, let's just say the tribe receives 8 million, you're only allowed to claim up to 8 million revenue replacement. But that's all dependent upon how the tribe strategizes in using its money. At the end of the day, you can go down the path of general government services, which ultimately has more flexibility, if you will. versus if you go the other route of the other options that are within the FRF funds, you'll have, a little more, requirements to follow. But that's just one thing to consider. I just wanted to point it out with respect to how much money you receive out of FRF funds. So.
Yeah, and Wes, that's great. That's a great point, Wes. And then one thing that I failed to mention, I said I was going to bring up is with revenue replacement, a question we get a lot is, well, do we go ahead and put the whole 10 million on the CFA or whatever our election is going to be on the CFA? You don't. So you're going to budget that amount, but it's only what you spend that year that's going to go on your CFA. So that's just a really, a question we get a lot. So just kind of make sure that whatever you elect, you're tracking that number. You have to track that number separate than your FRF funds, but on your CFA, it's only going to be what you actually expend in
right.
replacement.
And then one more point to that. I'm sorry. It's when tracking these funds, you have to remember not to the best transfer the revenue replacement funding to the general fund. You got to maintain that in your grants and contracts or your special revenue funds, whatever you utilize during the year, because at the end of the day, you should be able to track, or an auditor, if you will, would have to be able to track those funds into a specific fund. And because these are federal funds, even though Jeremy's talking about revenue placement for general fund like transactions, you still need to be able to track that in a specific fund, ultimately, which traces into your year-ending CFA. So that's just another point to consider. Thank you.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, Wes. Thank you, Jeremy. Great information on the revenue replacement information. I'm covering public health and negative economic impacts. And as we've worked a lot with tribal governments across the country, there's a variety of different buckets where these FRF funds can be spent. And we've found that many tribal governments are dedicating a lot of these resources into these categories, into public health and a response to the negative economic impacts of the public health crisis. So it's great. I also wanted to point out when at the conclusion, when the slides go out, we'll also be sending out a great resource from Treasury, the tribal fact sheet. It covers a lot of these. It spends a lot of time covering public health responses and negative economic impact responses. So it'll be a great summary of a lot of this information. Additionally, we always kind of like to cover what's called the compliance supplement. This is really kind of an auditor's guide, but taking a step back, it's really communicating to grantees and auditors what are the key areas of emphasis, what are the real compliance attributes that the agency is interested in wanting to make sure you're aware of to follow and comply with. Of course, A and B here, you can see allowable costs and allowable activities. How are the funds being spent is, of course, a very important compliance attribute. The period of performance, making sure that these costs were incurred after the start date of the FRF award timeline. Procurement, suspension, and debarment. If you're doing construction or major projects that involve bids, that involve competitive proposals, et cetera, that is an applicable important compliance attribute. Reporting, which of course many of you are familiar with, and then subrecipient monitoring. And when we say subrecipient monitoring, we're talking about a subrecipient relationship, passing the funds to another entity that is going to carry out and utilize those funds or administer the grant further at another level. Go forward here. Wes touched on it briefly earlier, but as we're talking specifically about allowable uses of the FRF funds, it is important to take a step back. Whenever we're receiving a new grant, something that's new at the federal level, new for every tribal government across the country, the uniform cost principles still apply. 2 CFR 200 subpart E cost principles still apply. And a couple of things we think are really important and that we've noticed, as tribal governments are thinking, how do we spend these funds in an allowable way? What's our reasoning for using the funds on Project A and Project B? A couple of things to consider are listed below here, found in Part 200, but it should be necessary and reasonable for the performance of the federal award. And additionally, in the next bullet point down below, would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time. as tribal governments oftentimes are trying to determine, is this an allowable use of the funds? Is this a project we can administer and run in a compliant way? And considering these things, documenting the decision-making process and the consideration of these factors really gives you a leg up when you're when the audit comes around, or if justifications need to be made to Treasury, showing that the prudent path was taken, the consideration was taken regarding these factors is a great path to follow. Additionally, tribal governments should follow their established practices and policies. So we're not throwing out all of our policies and procedures as we're administering ARPA awards. We really should be following those, and in certain cases, establishing new ones based on the types of projects that are being administered. We talked a little about the timeline, but a lot of grantees ask us, well, what rules are you following? As the auditor, you come in, are you following the interim rule, the final rule, the FAQs, this guidance, that guidance? Well, ultimately, it's the grantee's responsibility to determine these were the set of guidance that we were following when we made that when we determined and we're following that decision-making process. So provided that you have that support and you're communicating to auditors, to the agency, well, this is what we were reviewing and following at the time when we made this decision, that's appropriate. And auditors are going to consider all of those things as your awards are being audited. Wes mentioned previously as well, the final rule is really not effective until April 1, but the final ruling did clarify that we can take advantage of the final rule's flexibilities and simplifications ahead of its effective date. So that's as of now. All right, so talking about some of the eligible uses, public health and negative economic impacts. One real important clarification the final ruling simplified was households and tribal communities are presumed to be disproportionately impacted by the public health crisis and negative economic impacts of the pandemic. So what this really does is, whereas many state and local governments, entities, may be required to perform quite a bit of administrative analysis and evaluation of need, evaluation of harm as they look to provide assistance to individuals, some of that burden is removed from tribal governments. And so certain things like cash and food assistance, we see health insurance coverage expansion, paid sick and family leave, some of the administrative burden of evaluation of need is not required of tribal governments. It doesn't mean there's no evaluation, no documentation for why this is an appropriate use and why it's a allowable activity for the grant funds. But the evaluation of individual need on an individual beneficiary basis is not required for tribal governments. So really great. And as we mentioned, a lot of the simplification is making it easier for tribal governments to administer the awards. This is really fantastic. Some other items that the final ruling specifically lists are financial services for the unbanked, underbanked, affording affordable housing development and permanent supporting housing, childcare and early learning services, and improvements to vacant or abandoned property. So a lot of these things, along with many others that apply in these buckets, can be performed without that undue additional analysis and administrative burden of determining need or harm. The final rule also clarified, a bit regarding capital expenditures for tribal governments, and it talks about, well, first off, the capital expenditures still have to fit into the bucket. They still have to support an eligible COVID-19 public health or economic response. We can't just build a building that we've been wanting for decades, and finally, it still has to be tied back into a response to the pandemic, or an economic response, a public health response. And a few that are mentioned, I think these are very narrow. We've seen tribal governments document an economic response or a public health response outside of what these few bullet points here, but these are ones that the final ruling specifically outlined, and that's affordable housing, child care facilities or schools, hospitals, as sort of a jumping off point, but certainly a lot of economic or public health responses that involve capital or construction projects could certainly be beneficial to tribal governments. Additionally, the last bullet point there, you see tribal governments are exempt from the requirement to complete a written justification for capital expenditures. Again, if you're hearing, the consistent theme, some of the administrative burden is being lifted off of tribal governments as we're administering these awards. Specifically talking about responses to the negative economic effects of the public health crisis. But the final ruling simplified the administration of funds used to assist tribal small businesses, tribal enterprises. First off, again, presumed to be disproportionately impacted by the public health crisis. So not only tribal members and communities, but also the associated tribal enterprises that support tribal governments and tribal communities. Some options for assistance include loans or grants. They are permitted to mitigate financial hardship. Again, that financial hardship is presumed. Some documentation of the occurrence and how the pandemic impacted the enterprise or small business is great. When it says loans or grants, when it's talking about grants, a lot of times the first thing that comes to our mind is, oh, there must be a subrecipient. We're passing a grant. No, in this case, I think the final ruling is really referring to tribal enterprises as the beneficiary of the award, not a subrecipient. They're not going to continue administering the award, but rather they're the beneficiary to improve the economic conditions of that enterprise and as a result, the tribal community. Additionally, technical assistance or business planning help is mentioned. Along with that, tribal development districts are included by Treasury. That's really a broad term for tribal enterprise-related activity. Could be an entity that oversees the tribe's economic conditions or businesses, or just those entities themselves, those tribal enterprises. Lastly on here, the final rule did provide a broader menu of options for tribes to restore and support public sector workforce. Many tribal governments have been, really impacted with available staffing levels and working professionals to administer their tribal governments. So some options on here that are mentioned covering payroll for public safety, health and human services staff for time spent responding to COVID-19. I don't think that was a surprise, but the other ones here are hiring public sector staff up to 7.5% above pre-pandemic workforce levels, avoiding layoffs that may have been otherwise necessary, providing retention incentives. Again, if you're having trouble attracting qualified professionals, that could be a great option. And then providing funds to employees that experience pay cuts or furloughs, again, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So those are some basic summary of a lot of the final ruling updates and clarifications in relation to responding to public health and negative economic impacts. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Hattie to talk about premium pay.
Bonjour, my name is Hattie Mitchell, and I'm a senior manager with the Client Accounting and Advisory Services. And I will be going over premium pay. The last time that we met, we covered the differences between hazard pay in the CARES Act and versus the premium pay in the state and local fiscal recovery funds. The premium pay in the Treasury guidance provides more detailed requirements, which we'll cover, and then I'll go over some of the updates since we last met. Mike, if you could go ahead. Thank you. So here we have defined that premium pay is available for eligible workers performing essential work during the COVID-19 to maintain continuity of operations of essential critical infrastructure sectors and other sectors deemed necessary by the tribal government. This was more clarified in the latest final rule that a tribal government can deem critical infrastructure sectors. So here we could say that if the tribal government can designate a tribal enterprise, for example. But this also follows more restrictions, and it says essential workers cannot be teleworkers. If you go ahead to the next slide, Mike. Here we have described essential workers are workers who regularly perform in-person work, interact with others at work, or physically handle items handled by others. Here it kind of describes some of the initial descriptions of the critical infrastructure sectors, which is healthcare, education, childcare, transportation, and other public health and safety. But this is further updated with the tribal government or our state or local territory could describe more critical infrastructure sectors. The funds can be paid retrospectively. Any work performed at any time since the start of COVID-19. The premium pay must be in addition to the wages and must not be incurred but prior to March 3rd of 2021. There are restrictions. You could go retrospectively or prospectively as long as you do not go above $13 an hour or $25,000 in aggregate per person. It was also further emphasized in the final rule that you have to prioritize lower income workers. Here it describes there's a restriction of 150% or the greater of a state or county average annual wage. This does not mean you can't go above that. You can go above this premium pay as long as you give the specific justification that is describes the need is how this worker is responding to the COVID pandemic. And also it does further extend and describes that you can pay to part-time workers. And to also clarify, these premium pay cannot be monies to reimburse the general fund. This has to be new outlay. So it has to be its own purpose and prospectively and retrospectively. It further describes that you can include third-party employers and contractors, and these can be determined by the tribal government or the state and local recipients. I did want to, it also further clarifies that those that are exempt from FLSA and overtime provisions may also receive pay. So that's all the updates that I have on premium pay. There's just very little updates, but more clarification. Mike, if you could go ahead and go to the next slide, and I'd like to turn it over to Wes.
Okay, thanks, Mike. I'm going to take this to the finish and basically wrap up with water, sewer, infrastructure, and broadband, and then kind of talk about just some things with respect to reporting. I'm sure those of you on the call have probably taken an attempt to go through and do the first set of reporting. I think last month was for a specific tier of tribal governments. And coming here in April 1st of 2022, I'm sorry, I think I got that right, but in April of 2022, you'll be going through the second tier. So we'll talk about that. Mike, going to the next slide. So when we're talking about infrastructure with respect to the fiscal recovery funds, I think one thing needs to be clear. There was a lot of talk about whether or not tribes could use this funding for roads and, building roads to, for certain residential areas and kind of putting money to that. Now, that is a possibility. I'm not saying you can't X that out because you can possibly allocate and put those projects in your general services bucket if you decide to go that route. But once again, as Mike mentioned, you'll have to justify how that is responding to COVID, so that is one thing. What we're talking about here is really trying to emphasize clean water and drinking water. These are the type of infrastructure projects that we're talking about in this one. And in addition to that, obviously broadband, which is wireless communication, bringing wireless to the reservation and all that good stuff. So that's what we're going to focus on here today. What the final rule did is align the projects, the listing of projects that are in the final rule to the EPA Clean Water Revolving State Funds and then the Drinking Water State Revolving Funds. So basically, those are kind of, if you will, the framework for thinking about what kind of projects you can have in your strategy. Some things that were mentioned is like, for clean water is water conservation, efficiency, or reuse measures. So any projects like for your community, or like from mine, like chapter houses, you might want to think about, conservation or reuse measures for distributing water, development and implementation of a conservation and management plan, stormwater or wastewater or domestic sewage. So if those are some projects that have been, long lost, those are things you can revive with these funds if it helps with recovery. The other is drinking water projects, if you will. Some of those that are listed are just, the one kind of interesting one was like if you have dams and reservoirs that supply drinking water, you could actually use some of these funds to help, rebuild, repair, or fix up those dams so that it basically at the end of the day produces clean drinking water. So those are some things you might want to consider if you're working on that. As a tip, one thing to take a look at is the National Association of Counties. I think that's a website. I forgot to put that on here, but they kind of list out all the projects from an infrastructure standpoint on what they are working on, if you will, utilizing these ARPA funds. A lot of them, if you look at it, are using them for stormwater treatments and replacements and so forth. So we could go to the next slide, Mike. So those are some things to really consider. I know that a lot of the trend really in any country is to do member distributions, which is definitely important. But you really want to consider in your allocation strategy about long-term infrastructure improvements, especially with ensuring clean water for future generations. Ensuring irrigation replacement for those tribes we see here in Arizona where I'm at, and then in other areas of the country. So those are some things to think about. And new eligible water sewer projects that we're now introduced into the final rule is culvert repairs. I'm no engineer or road guy, but apparently culverts are those stormwater tunnels. So this is an idea. If you have like let's say you're on the reservation and you have a road that's always being flooded out, this is something you can consider. Adding a small little culvert there to have the water flow through and have a community road go through. Resizing and removal or replacement of stormwater sewers, really thinking about going through this as far as an infrastructure project. Once again, just improving safe drinking water access to individuals served by residential wells. That includes testing and all that good stuff. Dam and reservoir rehabilitation. Once again, just if a tribe is located near a dam or reservoir, and that dam reservoir is producing any type of drinking water, then you could definitely make an argument that, any type of replacement or repair on that to improve it, to better the water quality, that's definitely an opportunity to think about. And then lastly, lead remediation projects. So in this one, I'm trying to think back about like what can tribes utilize this for. One thing to consider for schools, if schools need replacement of plumbing and it has a tie to lead, you definitely might want to consider that. Even childcare centers, if childcare centers were developed a long time ago and you're still utilizing those facilities and they have, replacement of plumbing and it's tied to lead, those are things to consider with this funding as well. Mike? Okay, just some other water sewer projects that you might want to think about. You want to build, upgrade, or replace any facilities that transport water, transmit water, distribution and storage of water. If there's opportunities for storage water facilities, and if that's something you might want to consider and the tribe owns, you could do that. Once again, just lead service lines. You want to construct and manage, publicly owned treatment centers for water, treat stormwater drainage centers. Once again, there's that. And then, here's a new one: is that address climate change. So a lot of times, there is the talk about climate change and really putting projects in place to address that. If there are projects that address sources of pollution in water, that is what you can use money for. Prevent pollutants from reaching drinking water. So if there's any incidents that happen, where there's the possibility of ruining water supply, you can utilize the funds to test and probably treat that water supply moving forward. And then lastly, cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is a big one that's been added. Well, with respect to water and sewer, what they're really talking about is just cybersecurity over more electronic systems that manage these water and sewer supplies. So they talk about that you can utilize these funds for these type of projects. So when we're talking about all these projects, and as you're thinking about it, and maybe you're a procurement officer and you're wondering about all this stuff and whatnot, one thing to keep in mind, Mike Dearlam showed that little listing of all the compliance requirements that are on there. One thing, what's probably been asked a lot of us is that, does Davis-Bacon apply? And the answer from the final rule is no, but it's encouraged. So throughout the final rule, there's a lot of must, should, it's encouraged. So you got a little more wiggle room if they say it's encouraged. And but not to say that, let's just say Davis-Bacon doesn't apply, but when you do your reporting, you have to supply certain information about your subcontractors, payment rates, and all that good stuff. So they didn't totally leave you off the hook as far as reporting, but from a compliance standpoint, like when Jeremy or Mike come in and start digging through your documents and testing for these projects, once they get going, they're not necessarily going to look for Davis-Bacon, but you still have to have justification for your projects. The other thing too, though, is that in the event you decide to utilize the FRF funds with other funding sources to carry out any of these projects, let's just say, for example, some sort of IHS water project, or excuse me if I'm making anything up, but I'm just trying to give it a good example here. And then you utilize the FRF funds in conjunction with that, then you are on the hook for Davis-Bacon. So you want to consider that when you're putting together your projects and strategizing on that. At the end of the day, you really want to consider, okay, what's administratively more burden to you, but at the same time, you want to consider whether or not Davis-Bacon will apply. And so that's one thing to think about when carrying out all your projects, and especially when your auditors are coming through, digging through stuff. So those are one things that you want to definitely document. Mike, next slide. Now, the next area is broadband. Really, the biggest change here is basically this upload and download megabyte per second structure they have. So ultimately, they want you to have what they call a symmetrical upload and download system. So you want to have 100 megabytes to upload and 100 megabytes to download. However, they realize that, well, hey man, we can't do that for all areas. Some tribes are closer to the city, some aren't, some don't even have an infrastructure in place to do it. So what they basically kind of want to start off point would be 100 megabytes download, 220 megabytes upload. So that's kind of, if you will, the starting point. And then ultimately, over time, they want you to scale it up to that 100 up and down. So that's one thing to think about. The referred infrastructure is fiber optics. So they want you to, if you have the option for fiber optics, they want you to utilize that as much as possible. And once again, it's not a requirement, but it's preferred, so that's one thing to consider. And then, another thing, there's cybersecurity investments, obviously with the way things are going with remote work, and having to, adapt to that, introduces all kinds of cybersecurity risks. So they want more investments from tribes to put money into that and really pay attention to your IT systems. Most of the time, most tribes have just very basic IT systems, and what these cybersecurity investments, one thing to consider is really upping your ability to be efficient and effective remotely and in the office. And then lastly, affordability is a requirement. So what I mean by that is they want tribes to really focus on being able to carry out, this broadband infrastructure and make it affordable. And what they refer to is the FCC's Affordability and Connectivity Program. That program allows for tribes to have $75 per month off the household in their internet bill, and then a one-time discount of $100 for purchase of laptop and desktop and computer tablets. So if you're on the call today, one thing to really check out is the FCC's Affordability and Connectivity Program. And if the tribe decides to put one together, that is one that you can utilize as a structure for a program. So that's one thing to consider. Next slide. Just once again, just kind of more of a depiction of what this is, really areas for investments. You want to prioritize projects that currently don't have up to the 100 megabytes per second. You have some flexibility based on, you can make a decision that if there's lack of access, affordability, or reliable of service. Your project design, you want to consider, really want to consider households and businesses are an option. Consider any other available data and determining cost areas for investment. And then lastly, low income is that you want to focus on low income residents, but most of the reservation is low income anyway, so the reservation could pretty much fit into this program here. And then as far as the structure, like how would we set up a structure for this? You just want to take a look at the FCC's website, which the final rule mentions, and then that they have a program there that you might want to utilize and take a look at. Next slide. Okay, reporting requirements. Okay, next slide, Mike. So with this, really just want to kind of reiterate the timelines. I'm kind of a timeline guy, so this was kind of an interesting depiction for me, how to put everything in perspective. Really, you want to focus on tier 3 and 4. Those are for tribes. And then all the other tiers are related to counties and cities. So really tier 3 and 4 is what tribes will focus on. Basically, the divider between the 3 and 4 is $30 million. If the tribe receives $30 million and above, then you've probably already gone through the exercise of going through and creating your project and expenditure report at the end of January. Now, if you receive less than 30 million, your reporting deadline is coming up at the end of April. And that's where you'll need to put in what you've spent so far, and then what you choose with respect to what Jeremy said. Are you picking the $10 million now, or you want to continue to calculate your revenue loss each year? Which is better for you? So you'll put that in there, and just kind of reading through just with other kind of comparable, if you will, of other types of entities that have put this in. Some counties have said that they put, let's just say they take the $10 million allowance, they put 0 in the first time, But then let's just say they change strategy and then decide by April 30th, they want to make that change. Since the final rule came out, they can make that change. So that's the thing that you want to consider. But after April 1st, you need to make a decision, as Jeremy mentioned, on what you want to use, the 10 million, or you want to use the calculation each year, excuse me. Mike, next slide. One thing just to consider with respect to reporting, with projects, you want to make sure that it goes into each category, that you can fill that out. There are 66 categories, so that's one thing that definitely research and think about. Once again, revenue replacement, it's a $10 million option you want to consider. Next slide, Mike. And then subawards, as Mike mentioned, there's those instances where tribes maybe get into a subrecipient agreement. So you need to create a subaward. Most instances in this manner is when, let's just say, a tribe gives money to a nonprofit or something to that effect, and you need to have an agreement in place. And then most other cases, it falls into that beneficiaries category, which was defined during the CARES Act funding. Next slide. Just final thoughts on this presentation is really just look at the tribe's needs. I'm sure everyone on the call has kind of gone through some sort of exercise on how to allocate the funds, whether or not the FRF funding is temporary. So you really should focus on non-recurring expenditures. And then lastly, obviously with the FRF funding, the investment earnings off of it are kept and can be used without restriction. So just to kind of really reiterate everything, remember, to think about the administrative burden that could possibly come out from revenue replacement calculations. Consider your premium pay options, as Hattie mentioned, and then all the different opportunities that come through with the economic development. And then lastly, with water, sewer, broadband, really just focus on drinking water and so forth. And then if another type of infrastructure comes into play, you might really want to consider that with your revenue replacement funds. But other than that, we're going to go ahead and I think leave it open for any questions that we have.
Yeah, Wes, there's a couple in the Q&A box that are directed towards you if you want to address those.
We have one with, can you go into Davis-Bacon wages a little further? You guys want to take this, or I can take it? It's up to you guys. Mike?
Sure, happy to. Just to, I guess just reiterating, what Wes mentioned is essentially that Davis-Bacon, does not apply. So requiring our contractors and vendors to comply and provide certified payroll and pay the prevailing wage rate, et cetera, is not required. The exception being if there are commingled funds, maybe there's funding from the FRF funding along with something from the BIA or IHS that are contributing towards a project. If we're commingling sources that pay for them, then you are required to comply with the Davis-Bacon wage rate requirements.
Okay, and then we have another question here. Do lines have to be shared with other providers? I'm assuming this is for broadband. That's a good question. I'll have to do a little more research on that, since that's more of an operational, I guess, if you will, question, not necessarily compliance within the final rule. But what we can do is try to get back to this individual and see if we can email them based on our research. Before the presentation, we did get a few questions. One was, for all IHS distributions on the ARPA are the POPs, and which will allow IDC charges. Well, that is, I guess in this case, we were talking about FRF funds. So you really want to consider if it's IHS related that you want to look at your grant award for your IHS funding, because there could be different compliance regulations to that. So what we covered are final rule compliance regulations. So that's one thing to consider. But it looks like we're at our time. Feel free to reach out to any of us. We're here for you for any questions you have. And we hope that this was informative and will help you in some of your decision making. And at the end of the day, we really want to provide this information out to you so that you can make the right decision for your tribal community, nation, and so forth. And thank you.
Yes, thanks everybody for joining us today. We hope you did find the information valuable. And at about this time tomorrow, you'll receive an email with a link to a web page that contains the webinar recording, along with a copy of the slides and the fact sheet that Mike Dearland mentioned earlier. So everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe. Bye.